Forward to this. So we have, as Neil remarked earlier, some contentious topics today. Some things which become passionate and inflammatory and hot topics. So let's have a look. So image, media, race, gender, and disability. First slide. You see the wheel of power and privilege. What do you think about that? Neil, any thoughts? No? Are you aware of how that's come about, what it means? No? What it is, it's that's a diagram. It's a kind of color wheel, because obviously you've probably seen a color wheel before at some point. And this one is a wheel, as they call it, of power and privilege. So it's a wheel of body size, ability, gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, race, ethnicity, skin color, indigeneity, citizenship, language, geography, social class, housing, what's the other one? Education, neurodiversity, physical, mental health, and ability. And if you have everything together, you are powerful. And if for some reason you're lacking one of these qualities, you become marginalized. That's the word they use. And so there's all these categories of evil: nativism, colonialism, colorism, racism, cisgenderism, sexism, sizeism, ableism, can't read that one, and heterosexism. And it's meant to illustrate the idea of what's called intersectionality. The idea that if you have more than one of these qualities of marginalization, that therefore you are more oppressed. And that people lacking these qualities, therefore, are necessarily oppressive. So that means you, Neil, you have a job, you have education, you're white, you're male, you're married, you're heterosexual, heteronormative. You have power and privilege in every possible direction. Therefore, the people around you who are not white, not male, not heterosexual, not heteronormative, not married, not educated, are therefore being oppressed by you.
Well, a lot of nonsense.
Well, that's one way that it is explicated.
Yeah.
That's and these various qualities are thought to intersect, to add to things. Now let's look first. Is there a form of truth in any of that? I'm not asking you to buy the whole thing. I'm saying, does it kind of, is there any form of truth which roughly, approximately intersects with this?
Well, I'm interested to hear your definition of it, Jeremy, because I hadn't appreciated that at all. I just looked at the kind of categories and saw I understood it to be just that depending the closer you were to the center, the more likelihood you were to be able to sort of access things, really, that you had more of a not instinctive, but kind of an automatic kind of capability potentially within that sphere, kind of thing. I hadn't appreciated what you're saying about the fact that other people might feel or experience us as exerting power, and that they kind of intersected. So that's interesting. Hmm.
You're going down the individualism again, aren't you, with this? Because if because,
Let's look first. What is true about this?
depends on your point of view, doesn't it? Um,
But what?
because it's I see some countries, the more oppressive a government is, the more I can't remember where he read it, but it was a source I read somewhere. If you've got an oppressive government, I don't mean a dictatorship or oppressive. Somehow they're more civilians can be more spiritual.
Oh, right.
So restricting certain freedoms can aid in allowing spirituality to grow and being grateful for what you have. So
That's like Jeremy was saying about the son of the colleague who'd gone out to Uganda, was it? And he'd
Yeah,
just come back and he'd been completely, challenged by their happiness, wasn't it? And
yeah.
that's what had inspired him to want to be confirmed,
yes,
thing,
so
isn't it? Yeah.
so be allowing to label a person or label yourself or label a race who's more oppressive or more oppressed than somebody else, I think is not quite right in a sense that you're still judging then, aren't you? You're labeling, you're making judgments on people, allowing to be judged by others. Where again, I thought again,
Let's look first at the truth behind this diagram, because at the moment you're critiquing it, you're pointing out the weaknesses of it or the ways
yeah,
in which it could be misled. But how is it true? What is actually true about this? And take language. You've got the thing there, the category of xenophobia there. Then you've got the general thing of language, and then it says non-English speaking, English speaking, native English. So that means from that segment, a native English speaker therefore oppresses other people in the world who don't speak English. Or a native English speaker has power that other people in the world do not have because they don't speak English as a native. Is there an element of truth to that?
I'm not so sure about the necessarily about the oppression one, but I think that there is in this country, I would say. I'm not sure if there is necessarily so much within um the younger generations for sure, but I think that there definitely is. What did we? It was interesting. The unconscious bias. So I've just been spending some time with my dad, who I really, he's a really good Christian man, and and there's so much right about him. But just when we have he makes incidental comments, and he was talking about the news and these two gentlemen that have well I don't really watch the news very much, so I might get it all wrong anyway, but he's talking about these stabbings and just sort of says things about black people or people of different ethnicities, and there's always a presumption that they're not really British, or that they're definitely seen as an incomer, and there's definitely and these kind of comments just sort of drop without any particular thought. And I wonder if there's quite a well, I would hope there's quite a shift in the generations, but I would say that there is definitely truth within certain aspects of this wheel for sure.
So, I mean, you're thinking in terms of the foreigner then.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Is that a problem though? Is it wrong to think of someone as a foreigner?
I don't think it is wrong to think of them as a foreigner, but I don't, well, is it wrong? I think it depends where that leads you in your thought. processes.
But that I'd say is precisely what is lacking from the diagram, in that at times I think it's absolutely correct to identify someone as a foreigner. But what do you do about it? And I'd say that is the big question. What do you do about it? And I'd say that's the thing which is completely missing from the diagram. Because, for example, non-English speaking in, for example, Brazil probably isn't a big deal. If you don't speak English in the middle of Brazil, that's probably not a problem.
Mm.
English may not confer advantage in a lot of places there. Why would you want to speak English in the middle of a huge country, which is a wealthy country full of opportunities and natural resources, when everyone speaks Portuguese? What's the point?
Is this not then pertinent to this country? Is this supposed to be a worldwide model then?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, I see.
But from the point of view of truth, does English confer advantage? Is it useful to know English? Well, in a lot of circumstances, yes, it is. But not all circumstances. If you want to, for example, sell street food in Shanghai, you'd probably do better to learn Mandarin, actually, than English.
But I suppose they might say, a bit like with anything, a bit like with all these things that we're looking at, that it is just a sort of tool for discussion rather than
Well, there are people, though, that really mean this kind of thing. And that's, to my mind, that's a problem. Because, to put it sort of gently, it's a bit of a blunt instrument. This is not subtle. It allocates power based on the ability to speak English or live in a city, or to be wealthy. That often brings with it a certain amount of power. To be a property owner, yes, college or university. But then, my daughter has just got engaged to a man who's a tree surgeon or an arborist or whatever they call him, does tree work. He hasn't been to college or university, but he earns a good income and he's a good bloke. Would it confer advantage on him to go to uni? Cost him a lot of money, probably wasted a lot of time, but in the end, he's actually really good at tree work. Wouldn't it be better if he just stuck at that?
Mm.
So what would be the point in sending him to university?
Mm.
So, but like you say, what do you do about it? What do you do about the foreigner? Is it necessarily evil to identify someone as a foreigner? If someone is a tourist in the UK, should they be treated as citizens? Should they have voting rights? Should they claim social state benefits if they're feeling hard up? Should they get automatically housed? We say probably not. No, not really. If someone wishes to emigrate to the UK, and you say, well, what's your plan when you get here? Well, they're saying, I'm going to declare myself homeless, claim state benefits and get housing from the local authority. Is that a good motive to come to the country? Is that really the kind of immigrant we want? And you're interviewing them in a foreign language. But then if someone is foreign, is that an excuse to attack them? No. Is that an excuse to swindle them, to defraud them, to sneer at them, to anything? Well, no, of course not. Why? Because they're people. The category of foreigners is neither here nor there. You just don't do wrong things to people because they're people.
Foreigners, their ethics and moral outlook will be completely alien to us and our outlook and understanding. So judging them by our standards or them judging us by their standards. So you need a common ground into which you can all agree upon.
Ideally, what would that ground be?
Well, I think you'd have to try and have some sort of engagement with them to try and discern what that ground might be. And I think it could be very different with different people. But I think that the common ground would be a willingness to try and engage to begin with, at least.
which is why, of course, we're doing the module
Yeah,
to try and
but
work out what that common ground is. That's
because
the whole point.
using your example, me being as a white European man, if I was to talk to a working class Asian woman, for example, that woman would be set. No, so what's the correct word? Present herself as being beneath me. I can't be delicate, but she submit to my authority as a man, and and making me a European man makes it more interesting conversation. I say that because I know a lot of Asian women who, when a man walks into the room, behave and act differently towards that man. So I think, again, the point I'm saying is you got to find a common ground now. Not I'm not sexist. Are they being sexist towards me? Again, so there's a lot of and they're submissive towards their men as you know they're mental. So that's just on gender and equality. Um, you can't. I don't think you can find the middle ground or even get close to finding common ground in certain areas of the world.
There we are.
Yes, you need to be aware of the cultural context.
Yeah.
If you can.
When you're talking about cultural context, what's the essential quality which you're discussing?
Fairness.
Well, that's an ethical quality, but what is more fundamental to the conversation than fairness? I mean, how do you actually discuss the idea of fairness in that context?
I think that's a good one, Neil. Respect, yeah.
But you're discussing the meaning of things.
Okay. That's
what you're talking about, isn't it?
You'd have to view everybody as your equal.
Not necessarily, but you need to negotiate things according to their meaning. What does it mean for a woman from Pakistan, for example, to defer to her husband? What does it mean if you walk in the room? What does it signify? What does it mean for her household? What does it mean that, what obligations does it put under her, or what obligations does it put on her husband? So these things are questions of meaning.
He's responsible for
taking. You need to have some idea of the meaning of it before you can discuss whether it's right or wrong or fair or fair or that kind of thing. Now, my problem with this wheel of power and privilege is that it reduces everything to power.
Yes.
It disregards meaning completely.
Yes.
Now, if you look at historical ethical systems or things, if you look at Aristotelian ethics or virtue ethics, that kind of thing, each one of them, you talk about the meaning or the graduations of vice or virtue or something. You're talking about, for example, in the virtue of courage, you're talking about recklessness, being in excess with no sensibility to danger whatsoever, complete insensibility to the sense of threat or danger, which meaning they're simply reckless or careless or negligent, and that they're going to do really stupid things because they're just not registering risk. But then you can go to the other end where people are excessively timid, where any possible risk thing reduces them and makes them impotent and unable to function. And what's necessary from a virtue ethical point of view is the quality of courage, so that you can overcome your sense of fear, you can assess the risk, and you can act according to what you think is right, according to the best principle that you have. But that means weighing up the meaning of all these things so that you can understand them. But in no part of that are you simply thinking of it as a transaction or as a test of power. Whereas this wheel of power and privilege assesses everything solely in context of power. Everything ultimately means simply power. So truth or goodness or meaning actually are not power in themselves. They're simply the tools for power, according to this way of thinking. So therefore, when it comes to education, for example, it accuses those of college or university of having power. But if they've, for example, got a degree in archaeology, that's the most useless degree there is in the world. No one ever got a job from a degree in archaeology. most people that do archaeology then have to do something else in order to get a job because they've just wasted 3 years of their life. So where's the power, the privilege? And it takes a certain privilege to be able to waste 3 years of your life and spend all that money. But at the end of it, what have you got? You got nothing. At the end of it, you still need a job. So what are you going to do then? So you can't simply, why do people do archaeology? Well, because it's so interesting. It's awesome. I'd love to do archaeology. Wouldn't it be cool to go and, just look at ancient statues and beautiful gold artifacts and paintings and, date things and make explorations in the deserts or the mountains or caves or whatever. And it just looks so interesting, doesn't it? That's why archaeology courses are always well subscribed. There's always loads of people wanting to do them. But also, there are far more people with archaeological qualifications than there are archaeological jobs. So you've got wads of people that graduate with no prospects of work. And so they end up doing something else. So the thing is that archaeology is a great thing to study just because it is so interesting. It's just so fascinating. But it doesn't actually confer any advantage on anyone. There's a certain prestige, if you're in Egypt, you have all this amazing Egyptology stuff. And the Egyptians are very proud of all their stuff. Rightly so. I mean, it's really interesting stuff. But it's not going to help them win a war, is it? They're not going to develop a new hydroelectric turbine on the River Nile from their Egyptian stuff. Their actual practicalities of feeding their population and defending their borders are completely separate from all that. So what's all the stuff actually for? Why does it matter? If ISIS go around blowing up monuments in Syria, I mean, why is that a problem? Why not blow them up? They don't actually do anything. But somehow it just seems horribly wrong because they're beautiful, they're significant, they're historical, they're interesting, they're fascinating. Part of them, they're kind of really great, they're wonderful. Why do you want to blow them up? What kind of nihilistic moron are you that you just want to go and blow up some beautiful statues in the middle of nowhere just because you feel vindictive? So at no point, though, the urge to simply smash up the statue is just an expression of power. That's nihilistic. They just want to destroy simply to exercise power. But ultimately, if you're going to actually assess everything in terms of power, you become a nihilist, because in the end, nothing means anything except power. The only thing you want is power. The only thing left is power. If you dismiss the value, the validity, the purpose of truth, of goodness, of virtue, of integrity, of everything else, all that you've got left is power. And that's like Voldemort said, there's no good or evil, there's only power, and those too weak to seek it. Which I think is a great line, actually. Rowling was on a roll when she wrote that one. So I think there's a kind of half-truth to this wheel of power and privilege, in that in certain circumstances, these things can confer advantage. It can be an advantage to be a settler sometimes, but sometimes it's better to be indigenous. Sometimes it's better to be white, but sometimes it's better not to be white. It depends where you are. But in the end, it's not just about power. It's about all these other things. Life does not consist simply of power. I think that's what this wheel of power and privilege completely misses. It misses the whole integrity of meaning, of goodness, of beauty and truth. And it categorizes people. If you live in the inner city, are all inner city dwellers the same? Well, of course not. They're people.
You change the word, Jeremy, for something else. Might you call it opportunity, maybe?
Well, things can be useful. It can be useful to have these things at times. But in the end, what you said is what you do about it, isn't it? What do you do with your foreignness or indigenousness or your linguistic ability? What are you actually going to do with it? The ability to speak English of itself is neither here nor there. The question is, what are you actually going to say?
I think that's how I read it, or how I took it was that was the point, is that potentially you're less able to do something with it if you are one of those people, um or you don't have one of those things. So yeah, so
And if I lived in
a
Russia,
bit like
I
when
think
we
I'd have a sense of urgency about learning Russian. So if someone comes here and they don't speak English, I think the first thing they've got to do is learn to speak English. Anyway, let's
the
move on.
sad fact is that people aren't necessarily taken at as people straight off. They are immediately kind of judged, arguably, on what people see straight off, rather than find out from coming into conversation. And so their opportunities perhaps are less
Have you noticed how many, as they call them, southpaws are successful in life?
How many what, sorry?
There's the word southpaw, meaning left-handed. Have you noticed that left-handed people are the amount of people who are successful who are left-handed is far in excess of their demographic proportion as a whole.
Really?
Why do you think that is?
Because they're able, well, that is the presumption, therefore, that they're actually ambidextrous, so they're able to utilize both things equally.
No, I think it's that being left-handed does give a minor disadvantage in life. Broadly speaking, it's better to be right-handed than left. But that means that if someone who is left-handed learns to overcome the obstacles, it actually gives them a depth of character which enables them to overcome other obstacles as well, which means they end up doing better in life than they would have done otherwise.
Mm.
And that can apply in a lot of things. You know, someone with a really ugly face, for example. It's not helpful to have a really ugly face. But if you've got a lot of good stuff going for you, and you learn to overcome that, then actually that can really set you up, because then you've learned to overcome problems. You learn to deal with things. And someone reasonably handsome like Neil will never have to deal with that. So he lacks the character building experience to do that. I mean, I'm not arguing in the face of, about mutilating people to give them good character. But having something to overcome can actually build your character, can strengthen you.
I think that's a fair point, but I think it might also depend on the situation that you find yourself in as well. I think if you have just that within a fairly or that and maybe something else, but if you have lots of things to overcome, I think that can be quite a challenge.
Yeah.
I need to go and chuck my kids to bed in a minute.
Okay.
But so I'll be back in 5 or 10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. There we are. So this is the idea of the image, which I think is really crucial, actually, to the whole question about ethics and morals and everything to do with that. Did you see in the email I put in an extension of this?
Yeah, I think I did. Yeah.
Because I kind of query the way they've translated it. Let us make humankind. That's a very unnatural word, humankind. Adam is a very common word in Hebrew. It's a very ordinary kind of word, whereas humankind is a very clunky kind of word. And it means a kind of generic word, meaning the kind of everyone at once kind of thing. But Adam obviously doesn't have just that meaning. It has the everyone at once meaning, but not just that meaning. And because of that, I personally think the nearest analogy to the word Adam in English is actually the word man, which is how it used to be pronounced, translated.
Mm.
Because the idea of man used to be considered, the idea of the human race, man as mankind, but also an human, a single non-specific human is a man, but also it means a male human adult, and it also means a bloke, you know. So, and the word Adam also is the proper name, of course, as well as all those other things.
Mm.
So I think the reason they've put the word humankind there is because they don't want to use the word man, which is the word they
Yeah.
used to use. They don't want to use the word man because, from a feminist point of view, that's unacceptable. They have to get rid of the M word. But to my mind, you've actually obfuscated the meaning of the text because he, well, that's the reason I put it in the email. If I just turn to the email again, we just share the email. Where's the email?
I've actually got it because that's how I got into tonight.
Yeah, here we are. I found it now. Let's see. What I'll do is I'll make it big. Okay. Right. So I translated it there and I put in brackets each time. So let us make man Adam in our image. The translation here I've got, by the way, is not my own. It's the ESV, English Standard Version. Let us make Adam in our image after. So let them, notice the plural, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds, the heavens, the livestock, blah, 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 blah. Then this, I think, is interesting, this little like poetic triplet, because this, to my mind, sums it all up. And in here, you've got the alternation between the singular and the plural. So you've got, so God created man, Adam, in his own image. So that's open-ended. In the image of God, he created him, singular, male and female, he created them, plural. And then you go on to Genesis 2. But there was no man to work the ground, and a mist was going up and watering the ground. So God formed the Adam, the man, of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. So here, the his is a singular masculine possessive suffix in Hebrew. Hebrew is very specific about this kind of thing. So if it was a plural, for example, it would say their nostrils. If it was a woman, it would say her nostrils. And if it was a lot of women, they'd say her plural nostrils. Hebrew is extremely precise. So it says his nostrils, the breath of life, and the man Adam became a living creature, and that's a singular again. So now you're talking about a very specific thing here.
We're definitely talking about a male.
Yeah.
A singular male.
Took the man and put him into the garden. Now, the gender of the noun in Hebrew can be, if you like, inessential. You know, because all Hebrew nouns are gendered, either masculine or feminine. There's no neuter in Hebrew. And it's not always significant. So, you know, that the him could be insignificant, except that everything else talks about it as if it's just a bloke. The Lord commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat blah, 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 or else you'll die. It's not good for the man to be alone. I'll make a helper fit for him. And then, so gradually through this, you've got this shift from a non-specific generic humanoid creature, the Adam to work the ground, to the husband of Eve, the Ish of Isha. So, but the thing is, that word Adam is the same throughout this whole 2 chapters. And so if you read this in Hebrew, to my mind, these things all run together. The only departure from this is where it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. Then you got, therefore a man, Ish, shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his Isha, his wife, and they shall become flesh. And then it goes back to Adam, and then Adam and his wife Isha were both naked and were not ashamed. So there the word Adam plainly means a human male. Elsewhere it might mean the human race, or it might mean a generic human being, but there it has to mean a human male. And there it's the Adam, so it's not a proper name either. Whereas in this part here, Genesis 20:21, but for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. So there it seems to be used as a proper name. It's not a definite article there. It's not, but for the Adam, there's not a helper fit. It was for Adam. And it's not an indefinite noun then. It's not for a man, there was not a helper fit for him. That doesn't really quite work. So I think through this passage in Genesis, you have this kind of sliding meaning of the word Adam, which is designed to invoke the human race, everyone together, but also designed to invoke the image of a single man as well as the specific one. And where I think that's important is because in the whole salvation history, then you've got Jesus, who is the new Adam, the new man, the man from heaven. For as in Adam will die, even so in Christ shall be made alive. And you got that whole kind of theology of the new Adam, the new man, the new type, the new archetype, and all this kind of stuff. And then Jesus, of course, is the bridegroom, and the church is the bride. So you have the kind of the Genesis story reiterated at the end in Revelation, in which you get the consummation of the wedding feast of the Lamb. So it's really important, I think, in this story to keep hold of the idea of the man, the human, physical, male, adult, as well as all the others. And that's why I dislike it when they say humankind, because then they're messing it all up. And that's why I think the word Adam, man in English works far better, because the word man can successfully bring all those ideas together. The only thing you lose then is that you can't differentiate between the man Adam and the man Ish.
Mm.
But then you could do it with big and little letters. I mean, the Adam could be always written with a capital M, whereas the Ish could be written with a little m. You know, but Lord written in caps and the word Lord written without caps, and he in the Bible implies the divine name and the title, you know, Adonai. So that's possible, that's doable. But I think this idea of the divine image is really important. This is absolutely, you know, the root of it all. And of course, and I think the whole thing about, it says the session considers ethical issues of power and privilege. The whole thing about an ethic is it's not about power, it's about obligation. You know, an ethic or a moral is an obligation, a duty placed upon someone that they ought to do something. Would you agree with that? I put it another way, if you can do something, is it right to do it? Or put it even more simplistically, is might right?
I think, as with anything, I guess it depends on your viewpoint on that ethic, whether you subscribe to that ethic.
Well, the idea of might is right is Churchill's critique of Nazism, as he put it, the primitive doctrine that might is right. The idea that because you have the capacity to do something, therefore you're perfectly entitled to do it, irrespective of its significance or morality or meaning. And that's the kind of nihilistic post-Nietzschean idea of power. Obviously, if you can't do something, then you can't do it, and therefore there's no ethical question because you can't do it. So the question is not can you do it? The question is should you do it? There we are. Did you read the chapter in Gill?
No, I didn't.
Oh, so I'll skip over that then.
Neil, if Neil has, do discuss it. That's fine.
No, I haven't. No.
No.
Oh.
A World Without Down Syndrome. Did you watch that?
I started that and it looks really good, but I didn't get through it.
So just briefly, just simple question: would you abort a Downs baby if you were told that your amniocentesis test showed positive, that therefore you had a percentage chance of giving a birth to a child with Down syndrome? Would you abort?
I would like to say not. I wouldn't. But I think it would probably be quite difficult to say what you would do until you're actually in that situation.
It's a very wise response. As I said there, we did not have the test. We wimped out because Nikki and I were getting on a bit. I was 40, she was 38 when our last child was conceived. Oh, getting on, they said, you know, you're getting old. You ought to have the test, see if you've got Down syndrome. And we thought, well, whatever we get, we're not going to abort anyway. So we're just not going to do it. So no, I'd rather not know.
Yeah, I don't remember.
So,
I don't really even remember it being discussed. I'm sure it must have been.
not necessarily. You know, if you were young and you know you had your children a few years ago, then I don't know.
Yeah, I think 38 for our last one.
Oh right,
Yeah,
that was us.
yeah, 29, 30 for the first, and yeah, but I don't like like with much. I'm afraid I don't remember.
Yeah. How would you feel if, you know, if your child was Down syndrome? Yeah, what would your initial reaction be, do you think?
Again, difficult. I think you might think, well, this is potentially going to go a bit differently to how we thought it might. And there we go.
I'd be upset. I mean, because you have all these hopes for your children. You want them to grow up and you want them to be beautiful and clever and rich. You want them to grow up, you want them to have their families of their own, and you want to be grandparents, all this kind of stuff. But you want them to grow up and, you know, get independent. And, you know, I know a woman with Down syndrome now in her 30s, and she lives with her parents. Her parents are getting on now. You know, her parents are in their late 70s now. And she's like a little child. Now, she's ever so sweet. I love her to bits. But at the age of 35 or whatever it is she is now, she's still a little child. And her parents are getting old. They're not going to live forever. You know, do you really want to be looking after a child in your 70s? Do you really want to have to look after someone that will always be a child for 30, 40, 50 years? It's tiring. And at the same time, she's, you know, there's something lovely about her. You know, they love her. Obviously, they love her. They love their little girl.
One of my bridesmaids, when they were pregnant, they were told that their child was going to be terribly, terribly damaged, I think. I'm not quite sure how you would put it, but they were advised it was going to be very difficult and very challenging. and they had to make the decision about what to do. And I remember my heart just going to them, you know, all the things that they were having to think about compared to the things that we had to think about, you know, at the stage, the same stages. And interestingly, it was not as bad as they oh no, you asked about as the medical professionals had laid it out to be. I mean, it wasn't physically or neurologically typical, but yeah, it is a very different journey that they're having, and I sort of wonder how that transition then is made for them to from dependence to independence, or if it ever will be, a bit like you're saying with this couple.
Yeah.
Very different journeys.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we didn't want to have the test because we didn't want to be put in a position where we have to make a choice knowingly. But we
Mm,
also knew that we did not want to have an abortion.
mm,
Yeah, we did not want to kill our child.
mm,
So we just said, no, I don't want to know.
mm,
People said to me at the time, you know, do you want to have a son? Because you've already got two daughters. So I said, I'll just get what I get. And they said, don't
mm,
you want to know? I said, no. There's nothing I can do about it.
mm,
Whatever we have, if we have a third daughter, I'm going to love my little girl. I'm going to love my daughter. And that's all there is to it.
mm.
And then we got a son.
Yeah, yeah.
Another species to girls, I tell you.
Yeah,
There
well, in the same boat.
we go. Anyway, um, there we go. All my little beautiful girls and boys, my charming children. So let's look at, gosh, that gets around, doesn't it? Journalistic ethics was the first topic. Should we go back to the slideshow? Right. Reflection on the creation of Adam. Sorry, I'm sharing again. There we go.
Speaking of children, hats off for having yours in bed so speedily, Neil.
Well,
Yeah, good man.
discipline.
Yeah, good man. Keep it up.
Has nothing to do with me.
So, where are we? Reflection on the creation of Adam. So that's just the picture. God imparting intellect to Adam. Now, what do you think about that? Bearing in mind we just read the story from Genesis chapter 2. What does this picture show? You know, what's good about it and what's maybe less good about it? Any idea?
Nope. Put us out of our
What?
misery.
When it says how God took the stuff of the ground and blew into his nostrils the gospel of life, does that look like that's what's happening there?
Well, no, not at all.
No, not at all. No, it's nothing like what's written in the Bible, is it? So what is he doing there? You know, what is Michelangelo showing us there? And does that say nothing to you, the picture? Is it just kind of a meaningless picture?
It's a picture. Oh, means nothing to me.
Yeah, it's not, doesn't do much for me either. But then I don't know how I would paint God, to be honest.
He's clothed one, isn't he?
Sorry?
He's the only one with clothes on.
Well, he is. Although there's some, oh, maybe that's his part of his
Robe. Yeah.
green tassels as well.
Oh, Adam hasn't got any clothes on.
No.
No.
The only one with clothes on is God, isn't it?
Very tactful tear in the picture there.
Yeah, indeed. He's obviously been working out as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of him.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we are. The creation of Adam. And it's obviously meant to evoke the idea of the image, the divine image, somehow reflecting the maker, the idea of the spark of life. It's interesting, they say God imparting intellect, that somehow the shape around God there is anatomically quite correct as a reflection of the brain. The question is the image of God intellect? Is that what the word image of God means?
Well, I think that's one idea, isn't it? Although there's a significance to our bodily nature as well, though.
Where else does it talk about the image of God in the Bible apart from the creation story?
Are we not even meant to try and make images, like idol images of God?
Yep, it certainly says that repetitively throughout the Old Testament. Yep, and that is actually linked to this, actually. I think that'd be a bit of a red herring now. So where else does it talk in a positive way about the image of God? Famous passage from one of the epistles?
I was going to say, can you narrow it down a little bit? Okay.
First, Colossians 1.
Hmm.
Do you know that one?
Go on, we'll let you tell us again.
Hang on, I'll find it. I'll bring it up on the screen so you can read it together. This is something which I find very interesting and which I think is more and more significant. Okay, right. Let's get rid of that. Let's find, where is it? Colossians 1. There we go. Right. Let's make the text a bit bigger. Right. There we go. You've heard blah blah blah. Look, there it is. How about that? 1 Corinthians 1. Sorry, Colossians.
Oh yes, the image of it. Yeah.
The invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So when you think about the image of God, Jesus is the image of God. Question is, what is meant then by Jesus? Well, it's the man, isn't it? So therefore, when you see that, that could be Jesus and the Father, as well as Adam and God. And both would be true. So there we are. Media. Public interest versus sensitive government information. Julius Assange, WikiLeaks. Do you think Julius Assange was a good bloke? Do you think it was good for him to spill all that stuff?
That goes right over my head, I'm afraid.
It actually was a disaster for a number of covert operations, and some people were put in danger directly by the leaks. So I think it was a little bit on the cavalier side on the part of Assange, and I don't think he actually understood quite the ramifications of it, and it was extremely harmful to some people. So the question is, was Julian Assange right to harm those people? Is it always good to spill the guts, to just spray it all out?
No, it's not, is it?
I think it's a very open-ended question because, of course, if the government becomes secretive and gets in the habit of lying, that's a bad thing. But there are some things which I think should be kept secret. Is Julian Assange the one to assess what should be secret and what should not?
I think also one might sort of ask, well, what was his motivation really in doing so? Was it all just for the greater good, and it was all just very, or did he have any kind of angle that he was trying to kind of work as well? I think that always comes.
When it first happened, I kind of did a bit of looking into him, and I kind of investigated him and looked into him and researched him and found stuff about him and everything. One thing that came across is that Julian Assange is massively impressed by himself. He really thinks he is someone special. He really, really thinks he's great. So I think there's an awful lot of ego involved in this. Whatever else was going on, that was an ego trip as well. Whether the ego trip was piggybacking on good principles or whether the good principles were just a piggyback for the ego trip, I don't know. I don't know enough about it, but here we are. So, privacy versus free speech. Are they, well, first of all, is that actually a correct dichotomy? What is the opposite of free speech?
Presumably controlled speech.
Yeah, absolutely. So is privacy the opposite of free speech?
No.
No, I don't think it is. I think you're right there. So what is the opposite of privacy?
Publicity, I suppose. Perhaps.
Yeah, publicity. I was thinking, intrusion. If the opposite of having a right to privacy, the opposite of that would be everyone else having a right to know everything about you. Is that right? Does everyone have a right to know everything about you?
No.
I don't think so, no. You know the whole French thing with shutters? It's actually about privacy. I read about it in a book called 80 Million Frenchmen Can't Be All Wrong. And it was talking about this thing with the shutters. Apparently it came in as to define the private space from intrusion, from tax inspectors and everything else. So, one of the, if you like, definitive aspects of the French personal character, the whole French way of life is the shutters. And I didn't realize how deeply significant they are because the shutters define the inner personal private space as opposed to the rest. So out in the garden, people can look at your garden and make all the rude remarks they want, but with your shutters, bugger off. You have no right to intrude. This is my space. And the whole bonjour au revoir thing in French shops is because when you go into a shop, you're in their private space. Therefore, you have to be polite to them and regard the fact that you are a visitor in their private space. And therefore, you have to say goodbye nicely. And that's the kind of whole French sort of courtesy of a shop. Where it kind of gets confusing is in, for example, a train station or a department store where it's not really clear what's private or what's public. But of course, as soon as you approach someone, you're then back into the private scenario. Hence, it's then proper to say bonjour, au revoir, merci bien, et au revoir, monsieur. After you've talked to the guard on the station platform or whatever. So, while you're interacting, you're in a private space, but once you've ceased interacting, you're back into the public space. So I found that really interesting as a kind of insight onto the kind of French character. What about free speech then? When is it right ever to control speech?
Yes.
Like to carry on?
Well, again, if it's incites, but incites certain behaviours.
So when would it be proper to control speech?
Again, it's within context of what's been spoken about. But I think when free speech becomes a tool for oppressing or so when it's used as oppression, where there's racial.
How do you define oppression? One example, Jordan Peterson was told by his employer in 2016 that he was criminally liable for using the wrong pronouns with a transgender student.
Yeah, yes, I think I
was considered by the transgender lobby as an act of oppression. Jordan Peterson, however, said no, he didn't wish to be rude or inconsiderate, but at the same time, to criminalize his speech was wrong.
Oh, gotta go. I got footsteps coming down the stairs.
There we are, free speech.
I just dipped out there.
Yeah. Neil was saying that it can be right to control speech sometimes if free speech becomes oppressive. So I said, when is define oppression? And what is cogitating over that? I brought up the memory of Jordan Peterson being prosecuted by his university for misgendering a trans student. And he said that his speech should not be criminalized or a disciplinary measure. He had no particular wish to be rude or inconsiderate, but at the same time, you can't criminalize someone's speech. Gone again. Right. So fantasy, poetic license, fake news versus truth. Disinformation during COVID. What actual disinformation was coming out during COVID?
I'm not sure, possibly about the absolute necessity of being vaccinated. Some people might say that was disinformation.
Yeah,
well,
but that's not the disinformation that has been criticized at the time, is it?
No.
And one example of disinformation at the time was the idea that the virus came from the virology lab at Wuhan.
Oh, yes. Yeah, okay.
And that's basically, I think, true.
That it did?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen nothing to suggest it didn't come from the lab, and I've seen plenty to suggest that it did. So every time another piece of actual evidence emerges, it makes the link to the lab stronger.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just a couple of circumstantial bits. It's like huge trails of evidence that suddenly stop. But before they suddenly evaporate, they're in your lab. So it
Yeah.
looks like it was came out of the lab, and the Chinese have worked hard to cover up that fact, except
Mm.
they can't actually fabricate evidence from somewhere else. So I said disinformation during COVID is a very good example of when disinformation is information and vice versa. So the question is, what actually is disinformation, and how do you adjudicate it? How do you know what's true and what isn't true?
Well, I think that's the same with lots of things, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Would that be an argument then for free speech?
well, it's very difficult free speech because I think in an ideal world, one would say there sh perhaps there should be platforms for free speech where if people do want to air what could be perceived to be a potentially agitating or um sort of something that might challenge or prove problematic, um, it, they should be allowed to address that in a way where it's out, but it could be sort of it's a forum for discussion rather than just somebody going around and spouting their ideas, which potentially could be perceived to be harmful or become harmful if they're kind of forced to 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 do it in a way that becomes kind of subversive. But all of these ideas are quite good in theory, and how one actually puts them into practice is a different matter.
To take one example of that, the leader of the British National Party, I think he was called Griffin,
Mm.
was once on Question Time. Was that a good move, do you think?
Well, like with lots of things, it's all very complicated, isn't it? Because I think that potentially when ideas are sort of seen to be um, disallowed or forced underground or something, they're something they potentially become more than they might necessarily have been otherwise, and it allows sort of it allows an argument of, well, why haven't I been allowed to say this, which then just continues to feed people's fear or people's kind of suspicion or people's um sense that obviously people in power are trying to control and uh, so I think it potentially it could be, but it's how things are then managed and what people hear, because what people say and what people hear and how they communicate, um so I again it's about management of things, isn't it, and how things are handled.
I
uh,
thought it's really good that he was on there personally because um, the BNP always seemed a bit of a unpleasant and but possibly slightly sinister group of people.
mm,
But when you actually saw him in real life, you realised that he's a non-entity. He's a nobody.
mm,
And by turning up, on Question Time with far more credible people of far higher caliber than himself. He was shown up to be the non-entity that he is.
Mm.
He had no substance. He had nothing to offer the conversation, the discussion. He had no real answer to anything. He was only there because basically of the notoriety of the BNP.
Mm.
But the BNP is, as I've said at the time, if that's the best of British fascism, we've got nothing to worry about on that front. I mean, so I thought it was an excellent to have him on there. It showed him up for what he was.
Mm.
Give him his chance in the open. I'd say that
Well, bringing something into the light, isn't it?
yeah, I'd say that one of the great things about free speech is you give everyone a chance to make a fool of themselves in public.
Mm.
Go for it, do it. Let's see what you've got. And then you really see. There's that saying. If you remain silent, people might think you're stupid, but if you speak, they'll know.
Oh dear.
Yeah. So no, I personally, I mean, everything you've brought up so far would suggest free speech, broadly speaking, is a good thing.
Mm.
But obviously, well, I say obviously, it does beg the question whether, for example, pornography. There's that film, The People versus Larry Flint, in which the pornographic magazine Hustler was being harassed by agents of the government, I think. And
Oh, I didn't appreciate it was a pornographic magazine. Right.
well, it's like Playboy, it's that kind of thing.
Mm.
Except I think it was a bit more kind of full on than Playboy.
Mm.
I can't recall actually seeing a copy of Hustler. It's a bit before my time. But Playboy tended to be, as far as I can recall, like ladies with little or nothing on.
Mm.
That, to be honest, the whole kind of Playboy look is I don't really find appealing. It's the kind of brassy, made up, sort of highly artificial look that Americans seem to go for with that kind of thing.
Mm.
Whereas, as far as I think, Hustler went for things, that were a bit more kind of explicit. I think I may be wrong there, and therefore he was being harassed, and he argued that the constitutional right to free speech guaranteed that he should be free to publish his magazine, and I think he won the case.
Mm.
What about, for example, the banning of Lady Chatterley's Lover and then the unbanning of it?
Well, again, I think that once you make something kind of taboo, potentially, then it becomes all that more, it becomes more, arguably becomes more exciting, potentially, more sought after, more, you think, well, this is going to be something that I want, potentially, if you're of that mind.
Would you argue that we're better off because Lady Chatterley's Lover is now freely available than we were before when it was not so freely available?
I rather imagine that less people are interested to buy it because they have the choice to be able to do so. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I've never read it, but one thing
I've never read it.
Annoying about it was that it's an elaborately contrived plot in which there's to make adultery appear virtuous.
Oh.
And I just found the whole fact that the author wanted to make this elaborate contrivance in the plot to create a virtuous adultery, I just found that annoying because adultery is not virtuous. And therefore, to somehow exploit, to make it, to sort of invert it. I mean, I haven't read the novel and I can't really be bothered to, frankly. I read The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which is another one a bit like that in its own way. And, it contained a lot of sort of sexual kind of imagery. But the thing about The Unbearable Lightness of Being was I thought it trivialized life. So I don't think either of these are actually really good literary works, I don't think they're really important as literature. And I think the trivialization of marriage in Lady Chatterley's Lover, the idea that they wanted to create the virtue of adultery, I think actually is harmful. It's not true in that adultery is harmful. It is not virtuous, and marriage is a good thing. So to create a novel with the explicit posit to somehow denigrate marriage and to create adultery specifically, not just fornication or free love or passionate romance, but actual adultery as somehow being virtuous, I just think why? It's nihilistic. So I could sort of sympathize with those that wanted, to ban it. But then, as you say, banning it makes it seem more exciting.
So I think that one might sort of encourage instead of banning, but again, everything takes time and effort and inclination, doesn't it? But the more positive potential would be that one doesn't ban it, but one uses it as an opportunity for dialogue as to, well, this is what we might have had against it, and this is what we the position that we're coming from and why. Because
one interesting thing is that, say, if you take the time when Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned, a number of other things that were forbidden on public media. For example, certain forms of ethnic blindness, blinding, certain forms of language that were crude and vulgar and that kind of thing. And certain forms of blasphemy, and certain things couldn't actually be watched, as being pornographic, overly explicit or whatever. Are there any things which are simply forbidden now in media? Because obviously then those were forbidden. Those now have all been relaxed enormously. You can now watch, and quite ordinary films now, quite, raunchy kind of images, and you can hear every kind of language now on the TV. So is there anything now that's forbidden?
Well, I wouldn't say that.
Put it another way, are there things you just cannot put into a film now?
Sorry?
Are there things you just can't put into a film now, onto a TV program?
Yeah, I think, as I say, the only thing I can think of would be to do with I'm a bit wimpy in what I watch, so I probably wouldn't go anywhere near anything that looked like it was involved in any sort of child abuse. But
oh yeah,
Vikings. There's all
that's one thing which is carried on. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes, no, that's still illegal, and people that actually have possession of that kind of thing actually are criminally prosecuted still. That's interesting, actually, because I'd forgotten about that, and that is one area which absolutely has stayed. Yeah. Now, I was thinking of trigger warnings on films now and on TV shows. So, for example, do you remember It Ain't Half Hot, Mum?
Yes.
Do you remember the guy in the turban at the end? Every art Hindu proverb will say, man with wooden leg with deathwatch beetle better off than man with tin leg in thunderstorm.
But I suppose Little Britain as well is a perfect example of comedy of its day, but you wouldn't put that show.
No, well, that was actually Spike Milligan doing that.
Yeah.
So Spike Milligan, a European comedian, was acting the part of being an Indian, Phagocular effect. Now that wouldn't be permitted now, would it?
No.
That would be absolutely forbidden. Das ist verboten. No way. Not a chance. So I think it's interesting that now we still have taboos, we still have censorship, but it's completely different topics. Completely different. You can swear and cuss and use the foulest language you can think of. You can sprawl out with no clothes on, no problem. You can have the most horrendous violence, not a big deal. You can have the most meaningless, nihilistic death toll, no worries. But you can't possibly have a European dressed up as a black man or a brown man. Nope, no way. Not a chance. Anyway, let's look into this anti-social media as opposed to social media, cyberbullying. Did you see this little movie? Did you watch the movie, Neil?
No.
No? Oh, well. I mean, to be honest, they don't really say anything in the movie except basically a tiny bit of explanation on each of these 10 things.
Yeah.
Why are these unethical?
It stands to reason what I another question. Well, it's ever self-evident there, aren't they?
Well, no, it's never self-evident. You've always got to explain. Why is it wrong?
Or to publicly humiliate somebody. Well,
Outing. Why is outing wrong?
you're attacking an
Well, it's
individual.
against somebody's privacy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Possibly, but it's kind of there might be negotiations about what constitutes what you might call proper privacy, and what needs to be known. What is the core problem with outing?
They're taking control from a person, aren't they? They're taking away that person's choice.
Could be that. And what would that be then? How would you categorize that?
Well, I'm assuming outing is in what terms are you understanding outing? Is outing somebody on their sexuality, or outing somebody on their political view, outing somebody on their bad behaviour, outing somebody?
Well, at one level, it doesn't really matter. If it's a public humiliation, it doesn't really matter what the detail of it is. What at core is wrong with doing that?
Again, it's taking away somebody's freedom, like it's freedom of choice, freedom of privacy. That's what you're taking from them, aren't you?
So, what's another way of describing that then?
Sorry, I don't understand.
Well, you might say it's like taking someone captive or overpowering them, or
Oppressing them. You're oppressing a person.
possibly. But I was thinking it actually. I mean, I think you've got a good point there. Actually, the exertion of power to take away someone's agency, to take away their ability to choose. It's an act of tyranny, if you like, an act of oppressive control. But
Yeah.
also, to my mind, the thing which a lot of these have got in common is cruelty. They're just cruel.
Yeah. But yeah. But on the same hand, outing somebody's not necessarily always. Julian Assad outdid the American government publicly making. Do you know what I mean? So what he did was wrong, but on the same time, it depends on what or who you're publicly humiliating at the same time, doesn't it? If a governing body is behaving
In
wrong.
Julian Assange's case, you had secret agents embedded in an operation who were then outed by Julian Assange.
Yeah, yeah, well, yeah, but maybe that's a poor example then. But if you've got, but then again, how do you judge bad behavior? Who's
Yeah, that's right. I think that that's a question that you've been asking over some of these sessions, isn't it, Neil? Is, it's
whose morality, whose
it,
opinion,
who's,
who's right?
yeah, exactly. And we're
Yeah.
not called to judge, are we? It's
No,
not our
who
place.
who is God? Who are we to judge God? Who are we to judge anybody on this? I don't know. I just don't understand where this is coming from. Perhaps I just got a really naive look at the world.
Well, it struck me that most of these things, these 10 unethical things on it media, they have a component of cruelty to them, that people wish to
Mm.
harm another. There's an act of it's an act of malice, and the other part is that a lot of it's dishonest. It's perjurious. It's false. It's deliberately
Mm.
misleading. So if you took away the cruelty and the dishonesty, there wouldn't be an awful lot left there.
Mm.
So I'm wondering if wouldn't it be better to teach people to not be cruel and dishonest rather than try and get precise definitions of fraping and dissing and trolling and catfishing.
Well, certainly.
Yeah.
Mm.
But then that doesn't build character in people either, does it? If everybody's nice to each other, then the left-handed people of the world won't overcome their adversity, will they?
But they'll still have little things to overcome. Yeah, there we are. So I think a lot of this stuff is just electronic media creates opportunities for people to be cruel and crooked.
Well, it's just an advancement, it's just the next stage, isn't it? So we've just moved it from the playground onto in the playground, but on the iPhones, or it's just, as with so much, it moves from one level to the next as we get more technologically advanced. It's just,
Still human
And that
behavior.
was the thing. The number one was actually my biggest question mark because all the others are basically either cruel or crooked in some way or both. But the number one, exclusion, now that to my mind is questionable because one, does a child actually need social media?
no, they don't. But the the point was that at this point in time, although interestingly, my children say, actually, we're glad that you did what you did at the time that you did it, but at the time it didn't feel good. Now looking back, we weren't able to have conversations with our peers. We weren't involved in conversations about what they're watching on the television. We weren't able to do this and that and the other. And they did feel it was a feeling of exclusion. But whether that is um, whether it's wrong or whether they need social media, I'm not sure, but it is about a feeling of fitting in, a feeling of being one with your peers.
Granted that they'd have that sense of so perhaps being lacking because a lot of their peers do seem to have something. I would
Mm.
argue though that often children boast about things they don't in fact have.
Mm. Yeah.
And I think sometimes that sense of being lacking is actually imaginary in that the thing which the children feel they're lacking actually no one actually has or very few have. But a
Mm.
minority boast about it to the extent that somehow everyone thinks, oh, somehow there's something wrong with me that I haven't got it as well.
Mm.
And that's and I'm personally extremely skeptical about the value of smartphones for children. I would never personally advocate any child under the age of 16 having a smartphone. I really don't see any benefit to them, and I see plenty of things wrong with them.
Mm.
And what I'm seeing is now schools are basically banning them on the premises.
Mm.
So I'm a governor of a couple of schools, and they're introducing new cyber safety policies, one of which is simply banning smartphones. And a friend of mine is a teacher in a high school in West London, in Ealing, and there are no devices allowed on the premises ever under any circumstances. That's as simple as that.
Mm.
And any devices are then confiscated and kept till the end of term. So that one of exclusion I'd question, because as you observe, the children didn't particularly like it at the time, but in retrospect actually realise it's probably better. So I wonder if that isn't more like not giving a child sweets.
Well, that's right. Or having, it is just the next thing, isn't it? Having the designer clothes or
Yeah.
potentially.
And that, to my mind, is the advantage of, for example, having a school uniform, in that there's no scope for showing off in that respect. Everyone's wearing the same clothes.
Mm.
And there we are. So, systematic moral analysis. Did you watch this video?
Mm.
Um,
I didn't look at the case study about Robin Williams, though. Which is...
yeah. Reported too much detail about the suicide violated the family's privacy.
Mm.
Yeah. There we are. Do you want to watch the video, or should we move on?
I've watched it, but if Neil would like to, that's
No,
that's
move
fine.
on. Move on, please.
Okay. And did you get much out of the video? Do you think that was a useful way of trying to work your way through the questions or moral dilemmas that you might occur?
I think there was things in it. Yeah. I mean, I would hope that it's the sort of things that people would think about anyway. But I think, as with anything, sometimes it is actually good to put things, to put things down on paper, or to have, to actually have something said, because there's often a bit of a sort of presumption that's how people operate, or that's how they should. And sometimes just actually seeing something on paper, it just reinforces it, or it kind of consolidates one's kind of thinking. So I think, bless you, I think there was good within it. Yeah, it was interesting listening to the so they intersperse between this cartoon. You've seen it, have you, Jeremy? They
Yeah.
intersperse between these kind of cartoony bits and then actual people, and that was quite interesting, having their thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that's a good order? Do you think that's a good order of priority, that do your duty is number 10 and obey the law number 9, do not cheat number 8, 7, keep your promises, do not deceive, do not deprive of pleasure?
I don't know. For me, it's not an order. It's just I mean, I know it is in an order. It's just for me, it's just a list.
Okay.
I don't really take them as an order.
Okay.
So they could just all be bullet points for me rather than numbers.
Right. Okay. Okay. Interestingly, the one keep your promises became for me a very ethically important one when I was doing my business. I decided to make that my ethic of business. And I think that was absolutely right to do that. and it was a kind of given that I'd obey the law.
Mm.
The whole
I think
deprivation,
people
closure of
know
freedom.
that they can trust your word. I think that stands for a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that was really important, and I think that's a really important ethic to implant in people. Keep your word,
Mm. Mm.
because then do not deceive and do not cheat, to my mind, becomes superfluous then, because if you're going to keep your word, then you don't have the opportunity to deceive or cheat.
Mm.
Anyway, feminist ethics, starting point, and specifically the oppression of patriarchy, patterned or institutionalized legitimations of male superiority. What do you think? Is it necessarily care ethics? Is the connection of others necessarily a feminine thing? Can care ethics be separated from feminism? Is feminism necessarily about caring?
Well, I think that has there's levels, obviously, isn't there? And as with everything, there's exceptions to the rule. But I think that historically and traditionally, although again, I think that so look after the family financially, or it has to be said some evidence for it or truth for those roles for sure.
Um, oh, I mean, to my mind, you've got two completely different categories there. There's the idea of care, which they've made linked with the idea of femininity, and then there's feminism itself, which is the experience of patriarchy. And I'd say the two things aren't precisely the same.
Is that the problem we're facing? Is mixing up two different approaches and leave them under one, just as you said. Is that what we're getting at there? With feminist and care ethics, you're saying if they're linked,
Um,
how is care ethics feminist?
I found that kind of curiously ironic, the idea of care ethics being necessarily feminist, because it kind of implies, therefore, that men don't care.
Precisely. I'm a very
I
caring
thought that's a real exercise in gender stereotyping there.
Yeah,
The idea, the gender stereotypical, good father is the one who cares for his family,
precisely.
who provides for the family and protects for the family. And the idea of Christ is that he,
As
the Christ-like husband, father is the one who gives himself for his family.
self-sacrificing.
Yeah, self-sacrificing. So I found that kind of curious. That kind of jarred a bit with the whole concept of care ethics and the idea of being somehow necessarily a feminine ethic. I found that odd.
Yeah, yeah.
I found reading theology, there's kind of two broad streams of feminist theology. One which I thought was interesting and good, which took, if you like, the experience of women as the starting point, and therefore examined an issue specifically from that context or from that perspective, and which in in certain kinds could be really interesting. So there's a woman, a classicist um, who studied female priesthood in Hellenistic religion, or the role of the woman. So arguably a man could have done the study, but I think the fact no bloke thought of doing it, so because this woman was a classicist and a woman, therefore she wanted to study the role of women in Hellenistic religion. So she came up with this study, which I think was a really interesting, excellent piece of work, actually, a really good piece. And there's another woman whose name escapes me, who did a study of sacred prostitution. And again, she probably did it because she was a woman and therefore was interested in the topic, but she wanted to look at the idea of sacred prostitution throughout antiquity and see kind of where it came from and where it happened and everything else. And again, that was a really good study, a really interesting study. Thoroughly recommended if you're interested in antiquity and social customs. And there's another woman, an Egyptologist, who did a study of hair. And again, because she is a woman, she thought of studying hair. A lot of male Egyptologists probably didn't think of it just because men just generally aren't that interested in hair. So she did this study of hair, and therefore she studied wigs and she studied hair hygiene and head lice and shaving and combing and washing and styling and all kinds of things to do with it. And it was really interesting. You know, she made some really important discoveries, you know, really good stuff. But then I've read other feminist theological stuff, which to my mind is complete garbage, in that it's just a polemic against basically men. You know, it just seems to express a relentless hatred of men. And I just don't find that useful. It just doesn't seem to add insight or kind of constructive arguments about anything. So there we are. But then I'm not a woman, so how would I know? What's the next one? Feminist ethics. So the liberal paradigm emphasizes similarity between men and women. Genesis 3:28, no longer male or female. Are you familiar with that verse? Because I think because it came up, I put it in the email. Yeah, I did. No, did I? I thought I did.
Yeah, I know that verse.
Yeah. For as many of you were baptized into Christ as have put on Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, according to the promise. So, what is that saying? What does that verse say?
I read we all have the same value, the same worth.
I put the whole thing on there because that line is often taken as a feminist kind of maxim. Let's find it now. Where's the letter? And I think if it says there is neither male nor female, is it saying that men and women are interchangeable, that there is no essential difference between the two?
No.
I don't think so either.
They're saying, because you read the line before, it says Jew nor Greek. So
right.
Comparisons between individuals. It's equality, isn't it? We're all equal.
It's not precisely saying that. What is it saying? And what's the intention of it? Because obviously the writer has an intention. What is the writer's intention of that line?
It's for you all one in Christ. I think that's the
Yeah,
point.
and that's the intention. That's the point he's making. So what point is he counteracting?
That a Jew is no better or greater than a Greek.
Yeah,
Holds no greater worth, and a man is not better or worse than a female.
yeah, I think that's
So that, yeah,
now the reason I hold back from equality is because equality very quickly implies interchangeability. And at no point do I understand that meaning they're interchangeable,
no,
but they all have something in common. So I'll describe this as a description of commonality. They all have something in common. The thing which they have in common is they are all one in Christ Jesus. And so what is the thing which they have in common? To be one in Christ Jesus means what?
salvation, isn't it?
Sorry?
Being saved is
Yeah,
faith.
being saved. They're all saved. That's precisely it. They are all saved. So it's a statement about salvation. They're all saved. If you are Christ's, you are therefore Abraham's offspring, therefore inheritors according to the promise. So therefore, what he's saying is it doesn't matter what you are, it doesn't matter where you've come from, it doesn't matter your social status. If you are in Christ, you are saved and you are Abraham's offspring and you share in the promise. So he's saying the differences between you are trivial compared to what you have in common. But is he saying the differences we have are non-existent? What do you think? Do these differences still exist? So, for example, if you become saved in Christ, do you cease to be male?
No, he's still male. But he's just saved, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. So I think what it's saying is that being male or female, or slave or free, or Jew or Greek, is neither a barrier nor an advantage to being saved. And that being saved creates a collective in which we all have this commonality, which is being saved in Christ. And that Christ is truly inclusive and that he includes all these people, the Jews and the Greeks, the slaves and the free, the male and the female. But of course, that's not an exhaustive list. He doesn't just mean only Jews and Greeks. What he means is Jews, who are the chosen people, the peculiar people, and Greeks basically means everyone else, everyone that's not Jewish. But in the particular context he's writing it, they were either Jews or Greeks. So to my mind, this is not a statement of interchangeability or uniformity. It's a statement of commonality of salvation. That none of these things are a barrier or a hindrance or advantage to being saved. And so that's what I think that statement is.
Because is this kind of statement be used for same-sex marriages? I think it's been used as an argument, isn't it?
But it is invoked in that kind of context, yeah. In other words, it is invoked with the deliberate intention of making men and women interchangeable.
Yeah.
And to my mind, that's a misuse of it.
But if that's being promoted in religious circles, then is that not preaching false gospels?
Well, some people might say that, yeah.
Okay. So then,
but of course, some people will not. There are, if to return to the example of same-sex marriage,
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rachel. So in a peculiar kind of irony, you know, the Episcopal Church could only argue a moral imperative to bring in same-sex marriage because of the background in traditional Christianity, which had the idea of objective morality. That same objective morality which the people promulgating same-sex marriage rejected, because they'd regard the whole question as more fluid and more open to interpretation.
Yeah, I've been trying to do a bit of reading around it. It's just made me more certain of my opinion. I don't understand. I can't get my head around that the ethical argument.
Well, yeah, I'm sure you could see how, if you thought it was right, you'd feel.
I can understand it, but I just can't seem to agree with it, if that makes sense. I can understand the ethics behind it.
Well, I mean, if you struggle to understand something like it, it's always worth hearing people out who accept it, because then you need to hear their argument and understand it and work out, one, if it's true or not, and secondly, if it's not true, why it's not true, and work out, you know, if it's persuasive or not for you, and then what you're going to do about it.
Yes.
And that's one of the advantages of what you might call freedom of speech, that you need to hear things out, you need to analyze them and think about them and turn them over and you know, have that freedom to chew it over. So, you know, I'd have that Griffin bloke from the BNP in public so that we could you know, hear him say his bit. And to my mind, you know, see how ridiculous he is, you know, see how preposterous his platform was, and see basically what a non-entity he was. You know, I feel quite glad that we're in a country where someone who's, if you like, on the political margin, who's vilified and pilloried, you know, broadly ostracized from decent company, and yet can have that opportunity to appear in public, which, you know, to my mind is proper. You know, you should give people the opportunity to appear in public, and if possibly make a fool of themselves in public.
Yeah, it's surprising because I following what's happening with Farage, because they tried a similar approach with him, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite an interesting example, because he's one that's been hated, you know, a lot. And Trump, you know, Trump is hated, absolutely detested. He endures an awful lot of vilification, you know, in public life.
But he's
to the point where people actually attempted to shoot him, you know, twice. So, and of course, there's been, you know, you get the whole cancel culture thing of shutting people down and not deplatforming them, not allowing them to speak. And
freezing their assets.
Yeah, but I think I think in the long term, I think it's better to let things run their course, and hear them out. And there we are. Anyway, where are we now? Let's go back to the share, and then we'll look at the PowerPoint again. Right, feminist ethics. So you got the liberal paradigm, the similarity between men and women, tension, autonomy, and competition as starting points. You've got the social constructionist paradigm. We become male and female through upbringing, environment, social pressure, rationality, and power often equates social status. So I've heard it put, for example, that male and female are intrinsically meaningless, that the whole thing is a social construct. That everything about male and female is basically a social construct, that there is no necessary association between societal roles, functions, norms, or expectations and biology. And that was told to me at St. Michael's by the principal. So I'm not making that up, but is that true? Is it just a social construct, or is there more to it?
Definitely more to it, isn't it?
And why would you say that?
Why?
Well, I mean, at the very least, you've got the actual physical differences, haven't you? And and also, I mean, personalities differ. But I think that we would definitely say that there are some characteristics that are personality characteristics that perhaps are within a scale, but perhaps they would be on the higher end in a female, if we're perhaps looking at an average, and or on a higher end in a male. So I think there's definitely differences.
Now, some people would argue that those differences, to which you allude, are simply because of environment and social pressure.
No. They did an experiment on chimps, didn't they?
So I wouldn't know.
Yes, they did an experiment on how male and female chimps interact with certain different objects and interact with the world and the social, how male chimps or males will interact and address tasks differently.
Now, I mean, on the idea of that, so you got chimpanzees then being used as a behavioral test.
Yeah.
How far would that apply to people, and could that have an ethical application in people?
Well,
if you're talking
ultimately, we're not
chimpanzees,
chimps, are we?
no. Now, one reason
So it's interesting your observation of the toddlers. There didn't seem to be much division of the sexes there. It was just
no, they just were horrible to each other, irrespective. But with one reason I mention that is that bonobos, are kind of a species of ape similar to chimpanzees, but quite small, are notoriously promiscuous. They seem to use sex as a kind of social currency. Now, it has been implied that somehow this is virtuous, that therefore people can behave virtuously like bonobos by being sexually promiscuous. How does that fly? Is that reasonable? Should we imitate bonobos? Should bonobos teach us how to live, to be sexually, you might say non-committal, to be free in our liaisons with members of the opposite or indeed same sex? Should we simply use it as a social currency? If we go to a sherry party at the church, should we just have a kind of quickie in the corner as part of the normal social interaction with people we meet?
Well, it'd be quite a different social construct.
Well, I think the basic thing is we're not bonobos, are we?
No.
I mean, no, I don't think we can just shag around like that. That's silly. And the idea that somehow it's virtuous because bonobos do it. I mean, lions eat their children. Is that virtuous? Are we going to eat our children now to imitate lions? I mean, to my mind, it just doesn't apply. So I think one of the great, if you like, weaknesses of kind of evolutionary biological approaches to ethics is that you end up with things like imitating animals as a kind of virtue. And if you try hard enough, you could justify just about anything because there's some animal that does it as a matter of course. I'm sure if you tried hard enough, you could find a justification for almost anything. So the naturalist paradigm emphasizes the difference between males and females. It can ingrain stereotypes. Any comments? I know I sometimes bring it up, but did you ever see that that series Tribe with Bruce Perry, reality TV a few years ago?
No.
Because in that he would be initiated into different tribes, and one of the striking things about the tribes was that the differences between males and females were very strictly delineated. Each tribe had a very specific allocation of roles and duties and obligations to men and to women, and very rarely did they overlap. So, for example, among the Bushmen, the men would hunt and the women would collect, vegetable type foods. But the women would actually refuse to hunt, and the men would refuse to gather vegetables because that would be the wrong thing to do. I'm a man, therefore I do not have a bag and I do not go around gathering nuts. I'm a woman, therefore I'm not going to go and hunt. And if the woman gets the chance to club a small animal and then eat it, she will, but she's not going to hunt on behalf of the family. And if the man gets the opportunity to eat a few nuts or leaves or fruits on the way, then he will, but he's not going to collect a bundle for the family because he's out hunting. And one of the things that hit me about these tribes was that the various people in them were extremely secure in their identities. They were absolutely solid. They knew exactly who they were. They knew precisely what was expected of them, and they knew what to do because they've been trained for it their whole lives. Whereas the enormous difference in our society is a lot of young men and women haven't got the faintest idea what to do with themselves. They have no idea what to do. And because of the idea that somehow we shouldn't gender stereotype girls and boys in school, if anything, the way that school's set up is to oppose gender stereotyping, it means that actually they just don't know what to do. Sometimes girls feel the need to behave like boys almost as a kind of social obligation, even if they don't really have a taste for it. And then other times they, like girls who eventually have children, like at the TOTS group, haven't got the faintest idea to how to deal with babies because no one's shown them before. They just don't know what to do with a baby because to prepare them for motherhood would be a kind of gender stereotyping exercise. So therefore, they're not prepared for motherhood. Therefore, they kind of completely freak out when they become mothers because they just don't know what to do. And likewise, the boys aren't trained how to be fathers. So they get, and you get all this kind of confusion and insecurity. So as we become more and more specifically non-differentiated between male and female, it seems that the rates of insecurity and mental health and everything just seem to get worse and worse. So there we are. What are
I
we
think
supposed
with
to do?
a tribal situation,
Sorry?
within a tribal situation, within our situation, and I think we've in lots of things we've become scared to even approach the issue, and I think
Hmm. What's the time?
but but it needs the conversation needs to follow slightly different lines, I think, or it needs to be more specific. And I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to say there, but I think there does need to be some sort of identity.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of conscious of how unpopular this kind of thing is and how difficult it is to say this without appearing bad. But when my daughter told me that, when my prospective son-in-law told me he wanted to propose to my daughter, he asked for my blessing, which is a very patriarchal thing to do. I wanted to speak to her before agreeing, or if you like, or blessing them, because he is a working class man. He's a tree worker, arborist, and my daughter is very clever and cultured. She speaks French and Spanish, and she has read French and Spanish classical literature in the original languages at uni. So she's very cultured and very intelligent, and very well read and all that kind of thing. And he's not. And I said, are you going to be able to respect him? Because it's really important you respect your husband. And there'll be times when you'll find him annoying because he's not educated, he's not cultured like you are. And when you feel tempted to feel annoyed with him, to look down on him, to sneer at him, you mustn't. If you're going to marry him, you must not look down on him. You mustn't sneer at him. Not just because sneering and looking down on people are necessarily bad things, but in particular in that context, there'll be the temptation to do that. And it's particularly wrong because he will be her husband. And I think she should respect her husband. And basically, if she can't respect him, then don't marry him. Find a man you can respect. So from that point of view, what I was saying was complete gender stereotyping, but I think it's a wise form, which I think could be healthful in the long term. If she's going to do this, she needs to go into it with open eyes. And I've seen marriages break down because a woman married a man who she did not respect, who did not look after, look up to in any way, and ended up despising him, and either throwing him out or leaving him. And I've seen it happen a couple of times. And but it's horrible to see. And I really think, she needs to be able to respect her husband. So, that's what I cautioned her. And she said she'd thought about all that. And she realized that she did need to do that. So, she felt she could. So I said, okay, well, he's a good man. He is a good man. He's got a good heart. He's hardworking. He's industrious. He's honest. He's upright. And I promise you, my darling, he's going to love you forever. He will never betray you. Absolutely adores you. And I tell you now, I said, if you break up with him after you're getting married, he'll never get over it. He's a good man. So here we are. Anyway, gender and race. But it's getting really late now. Gosh, I haven't even looked at these things. There's an awful lot of ground to cover in this. Disability. There we are. Anything you want to say before we knock it on the head? What was the most important thing you learned today? What question remains in your mind?
How how do we achieve, a lot of the kind of aspirations that we have? I think that it's just patience and prayer, I guess, and trust and faith. I think it's all very critical, and yet will take time.
What in all of this, just to take all these things collectively, how does scripture tend to apply to these things?
Well, with grace.
Yep. And what else? What kind of generalizations does scripture make about all these things? And what about God as judge?
Well, yes, I would say that God is judge in all of it. And
when you think of God as sovereign, the creator, the reason that people don't all have the same abilities or the same opportunities is because broadly God made us this way. So is creation at fault then? Is there something wrong with the way God made it?
well, as you say, I don't think that, well, if again, it's very difficult to know, isn't it? Are any of these things that we've talked about, are any of these like disabilities, or is any of that a result of sin? Which I think arguably, if we just rule that out of an equation now, then we would say, well, actually, no, creation isn't wrong, but the way that we go about appreciating difference within creation, perhaps as a result of our sinfulness and our move towards individuality, whilst within that also not embracing individuality, wanting actually things to be normal, is not gracious. And we or what does it talk about? We have these implicit biases, these cultural sort of stereotypes, and we are slow to move towards this social model of disability particularly, but also a social model of inclusion and acceptance, and that is more likely, from my point of view, to be the result of our sinful flesh in action. Sorry, Neil, did I cut across you?
No.
No, I think that God has made us different intentionally, if you like. You know, we're not meant to be the same. We're not meant to be interchangeable. And because of that, because we're so wildly different in so many ways, obvious and unobvious, we can't possibly understand each other completely. You know,
No.
we're baffled by each other necessarily. So therefore, he's put us all, if you like, on a level playing field, not a level playing field of achievement or status or opportunity, a level playing field of challenge, in that none of us really know what everyone else is going through, and all of us have simply got to work it out for ourselves.
But I think that's almost a model for, well, that's how it is, isn't it? We see equally with God is that we can only know what we know, and so we have to try and learn and see and understand and engage and appreciate and journey with everybody else in the same way that we are growing and learning and journeying and finding out in our walk with God. So I think, you know, if we were all the same, then there wouldn't necessarily, well, be that that sort of incentive or inspiration to engage perhaps so much. So I think it's an opportunity, and it's and perhaps it's a challenge, but that's how we learn, and that's how we grow, and that's how we appreciate things that aren't ourselves. But we have become fearful of difference.
Well, fear is obviously a problem in scripture. It's described basically as evil. The only thing which we should fear is God. So, and that's the only true leveler, really. We're all going to die and we're all going to be judged. Those are to my mind, the only real equalities.
Yeah. Like I see a lot of people where I work, and I see a lot of different abilities, different levels of education, different classes. If you want to go down a class, I see it a lot. And from understanding this ethics, more the point, understanding my Christian belief, before I would look at the disabled person and I see a disabled person. Now, when I look at a disabled person or even a rich person or in a class, I am now seeing the humanity in that person. I can now see God in that person. It's an interesting way of seeing the world and trying to understand how to interpret one's religious values.
Well, it's true. They're all made in the divine image, and that really is I think that's the key to it all.
Yeah.
You know, that's how Jesus dealt with people. Whatever they were, he just kind of met them wherever he found them.
Yes.
And powerful or weak, beggars, cripples, unclean, clean, whatever. He just fielded them as they came.
I find that's quite a very powerful. Well, it's very powerful to me that it not empowers me, but it makes me have a deeper deeper faith when I'm dealing with people. I'm speaking to people. I'm blessed to be the way I am, and they're blessed to be the way they are because they can see somebody who's worse off than them. You know what I mean? It's not that they're worse off than me, but you know, we should all appreciate what we've got. And
I think you're right there.
Life, I think, and appreciation of.
That's why I wanted that song, "Blessed Be Your Name." That
you
know, whatever we're given, I think we need to.
And I see that every day in my work, so I'm truly am blessed.
There we are. It's really late now. It's past 10 o'clock. Let's go to bed.
Yeah.
So, Father, I just thank you for Neil and for Rachel, for their patient, good company, for their good nature, and for their sincerity, and for all the good stuff they bring with them. And we pray, Lord, for Kevin and for everyone else in this group. We pray, Lord, that you'll show them wonderful things, good things. And I pray, Father, that as we cogitate over these things, as we think about them, as we recall them, you can keep us going with them and help us, Lord, to be humble before you, to appreciate the goodness of your creation and what you've made in each one of us. Help us, Lord, to look with compassion on the people we meet, whatever they are, wherever they've come from, and see them, Lord, through your grace and your mercy and your goodness, your wisdom. We bless you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
There we are. Well, thank you both, my dear friends. May the Lord bless you both and have a good night.
Good night. God bless both.
Yeah. Good night.